as we look around in the world today, we find that there's a lot of effort that's made by people in the marketing business to try to define various categories of people. And they do incredible amounts of research, incredible amounts of opinion sampling and polling to try and identify all of these various market segments. And they can come in, they can identify, tell you an incredible amount of stuff about the characteristics of the people who subscribe to a certain magazine, who watch a certain television program, whatever it may be. That in turn is used to lure advertising, because the advertisers, television station, for instance, they've got this, particular program that they carry, and they've got all this marketing data, so they try to then pitch to people who are advertising things, who have a product to sell, that's really going to fit that particular audience. And they will try and show the advertisers, say, well, look, these are the demographics of our viewers, and they're in this age category, and this income category, and this education category, and they have these interests, and boy, you really need to advertise on our program. Your product. We look around and we realize that people often divide up into all these little segments, and they have different things that sort of define them. I guess my question to you would be, what is it that defines you? Most people are defined by the around. In a lot of cases, they're defined by a reaction to people, places, things. We use a term we talk about status symbols. Because a lot of folks are very conscious about their status, and they want the symbols that identify that status. And that symbol identifies them. In fact, there's a market for what are called knockoffs. Those are things that look like the status symbol, but they're a lot cheaper. And you buy it because, if you just sort of show it a little bit, it looks like a Rolex. Or it looks like, whatever it is. And that's the reason you got it, because it's not because you want to know what time it is and you need to watch. It was because you wanted something to impress the other guy. And depends, status for different people, or what defines different people, it can be a little bit different. Some people it's money. What they want is money. They're after money. That if they can just get enough money, that's good. They define their value, their worth, their identity sort of revolves around the money they're making. And with some people, it's not just the amount of money or the money that's in the bank; it's the status symbols that show that they've got money. Now, sometimes the folks that look like they've got a lot of money really don't. They owe everybody in the country for what they're driving and what they're wearing and what they've got. They may be only one paycheck away from bankruptcy. I mean, this is, you think, boy, that big house and that big car, I thought he had a lot of money. Well, no, he's mortgaged to the hilt. Sometimes the people that have a lot of money don't look like they have a lot of money. They've been squirreling it away. But people look for different things. For some people, it's money or the symbols that money can buy, because they value things based on money. For others, it's not so much the money. What really defines them, what they're after, is power. Money may be a means to an end, but it's not just the money that they want. They want power. They want control. And that really is what their life is all about. But that's not all. There are different things that, we live in a culture where one of the things that's certainly defines a lot of people is the desire for celebrity status. Oh, well, they want a prime example. Look at some of these. Well, I don't really advocate that you look at them a whole lot, but we're all aware of some of these television shows, so-called reality shows. Look at the things that people do in order to get on television. You look at that and you think, all right, why in the world would you, just make a total fool out of yourself in front of everybody? Hey, I'll be famous. All these people will see me. And so their 15 minutes of fame, they'll do incredible things. Some people, they really want to be respected. They want to be looked up to. Remember the Pharisees of Jesus' day, some of the religious leaders, and Jesus chided them about what defined them, what they were after. He said, you love to sit in the uppermost seats at a banquet or a feast. Like for people to greet you on the street. Oh, teacher so-and-so, doctor so-and-so. Oh, yes, They love the outward trappings. They were after status. It wasn't necessarily money. They wanted the status of respect, of people really being impressed with them. Some of them made quite a production when they dropped their money in the treasury box at the temple. They waited until there was a pretty good crowd around, and they would really try to attract attention. They were getting ready to drop theirs in. Others would make quite a production of public prayer. And that would attract attention, and people, in their mind, they thought, people are really going to recognize what a religious fellow I am. It can be respect. It can be approval. That's a little bit different. Some people want to be validated by other people. They want to be approved of. It's comes in as one of the reasons, one of the ways in which kids are often marketed too, because they have all these different marketing segments, including little kids, and there are certain brands that are the in brand. That is the brand of tennis shoes, the brand of t-shirt, the brand of jeans, whatever it may be. That's the brand. And if you wear that brand, there is a certain status that you've got, and if you don't, you got the Walmart special, I see. Well, and so, you got kids that are very status conscious of it. See, the reason is they feel like that they won't have the approval of the others if somehow they don't fit into the category. And they really desire that approval. It doesn't have to just be kids. There are a lot of adults fall into the same thing. Popularity. That's another aspect of it, a little different. What it comes down to is, for so many people, what defines them is what other people think. They allow themselves, they allow their lives to be defined by people and places and things, by others. I guess, in many ways, the original status seeker was a fellow by the name of Lucifer, mentioned back in Isaiah 14. Isaiah 14 in verse 12, it says, How are you fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How are you cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. You notice that? 2 verses, the word I is used 5 times. You'd have to say he's sort of, really revolving around himself. And he was a status seeker. He defined himself not by how much he could help or serve or benefit someone else, but I'm going to ascend. I'm going to exalt. I'm going to sit. I'm going to be like God. Very different than what Paul described about Jesus Christ in the book of Philippians chapter 2 when he said that, talking about the mind of Christ, who thought it was not something to be seized or grasped or held to be equal with God, but he emptied himself and came with the form of a servant. But Lucifer was certainly seeking for status. The religious leaders of Jesus' day had things that they were seeking for. In John chapter 5, we'll pick it up in verse 36. Now in the context John the Baptist had been under discussion and what he had done and his role. And Jesus now tells these religious leaders, John 5:36, he says, I have greater witness than that of John. For the works which the Father has given me to finish, the same works that I do, bear witness of them, that the Father has sent me. And the Father himself, which has sent me, has borne witness of me. You've neither heard his voice at any time nor seen his shape. You don't even have his word abiding in you. For whom he has sent, him you don't believe. Search the Scriptures, Jesus said. In them you think you have eternal life, and they are they which testify of me. You will not come to me that you may have life. I receive not honor from men, but I know you, that you have not the love of God in you. I'm come in my Father's name, and you don't receive me. Somebody else comes in his own name, you'll receive him. How can you believe which receive honor one of another, and seek not the honor that comes from God? Don't think that I'm going to accuse you to the Father. There's one that accuses you, even Moses, in whom you trust. For had you believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. If you believe not his writings, how are you going to believe my words? Jesus said, I've got plenty of witness that testifies of who I am. And he enumerated that. He said, the Scriptures bear witness of me. The Scriptures point to me. I'm identified and I fulfill the prophecies referring to the Messiah. There are many points of Scripture that point to me. The message that I teach identifies that I'm from the Father. The works that I do, the miraculous signs, all of these things identify and testify that I am who I say I am. But the real problem, he said, with the religious leaders, he said, how can you believe? Because you receive honor one of another, and seek not the honor that comes from God only. You see, they were defined by what other people around them thought. They were defined by the attitude of others. They wanted to be having a certain status. They wanted to be looked up to. They had certain position, and they were concerned about what other people thought, and that really defined them. They couldn't accept the testimony of God through either miraculous signs or through the testimony of the Scripture. They claimed to believe in Moses. Oh, they paid great lip service to Moses, but in reality, Christ said, you don't believe Moses. If you believe Moses, you'd believe me, because Moses pointed to me. Let's notice a little later, let's go back to John chapter 12. John chapter 12. In verse 42. It says, nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. They allowed their lives to be defined by what other people were saying about them. And they loved the praise of men. And obviously they loved it more than the praise of God. They were intimidated. They believed. They stood in the crowd. They heard Jesus preach. And they thought, I think he's right. I think that there's something to this. But they did not dare to outwardly confess him. Because the Pharisees had said, anyone who acknowledges this man, Jesus of Nazareth, anybody that wants to acknowledge him as the Messiah, you're going to be out of the synagogue. Oh, I don't want to be ostracized. I don't want to be cut off. I don't want to be humiliated. I don't want to lose all my status. I don't want to fall in that category. Notice, right along the same line, John chapter 9. Now here a tremendous miracle had taken place. Here was a man that had been blind from the time he was born. Now he was a full adult. And Jesus healed him. That created quite a stir, needless to say, because it was, the man had been in a place where people had seen him day in and day out. He was the guy that sat there, begging alms. Jesus healed him. Created quite a stir. So he was brought to the Pharisees. And they began to discuss it, and this was upsetting to them. So the original scenario was, verse 18 of John 9, some of the Jews didn't believe concerning him that he had been blind. He said, this whole thing is a fraud. It's fake. I don't believe this guy was ever blind. Well, if he was blind, he couldn't be seeing, could he? So somebody said, well, look, his parents are right over here. Let's go get them. Let's put them on the spot. And so the parents were called. Verse 19, they were asked, now we've got some questions to ask you. Well, this was an intimidating situation. Is this your son, whom you say was born blind? How does he now see? Well, the parents said, now look, yes, that's our son. We'll testify to that. That's our son. And he was born blind. We know that. We'll testify to that. Now, as for how he now sees, we don't know. Who opened his eyes? We don't know anything about that. He's of age. He's a grown man. You ask him, let him speak for himself. Verse 22, why did his parents say that? They were intimidated. These words spoke his parents because they feared the Jews. The Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was the Christ, confess he's the Messiah, you're out. You're out of the synagogue. So his parents tried to get off the hook by saying, well, you just have to ask our son. He'll have to speak for himself. We don't know. They were intimidated. They were afraid of what was going to happen to them. People were going to ostracize them. People were going to, quit doing business with them. People were going to not talk to them. They wouldn't be welcome. They were intimidated by that. Now it's interesting, that's sort of a sub-theme that runs through the Gospel of John. There are times when you know something, but there are various things that seemingly define you and keep you from acting on what you know. John chapter 3 opens with the story of Nicodemus. Nicodemus is mentioned 3 times in the book of John. We meet Nicodemus in John chapter 3. There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. So he was a man of status and position. He was not only a Pharisee, there were many Pharisees, thousands of Pharisees, but he was one of the rulers. He evidently had a seat on the Sanhedrin. He was a man of prominence and position. He came to Jesus by night. Now, stop and think about it. Why do you go to somebody at night? Jesus was in the temple regularly teaching during the daytime. This is during the days of unleavened bread. He had plenty of opportunity to come up to Jesus publicly. He didn't want anybody to see him talking to Jesus. He was intimidated. So he came to him privately by night. Now, several of them had been standing there. Jesus made quite a stir. He came in, cleansed the temple, chased the money changers out. But he confirmed his authority to do that by performing dramatic signs, miraculous signs, right there in the temple. People were healed. There was a powerful message preached. Nicodemus comes to him, because some of the Pharisees, they were in the crowd, they saw some of these things. Nicodemus was there along with others. He and some of his friends had been talking it over, and they had come to the conclusion, well, there must be something to this fellow. This is pretty impressive. We've never seen anything like this. So Nicodemus came privately by night and he said, Rabbi, we know you're a teacher sent from God. Nobody can do what you're doing except God's with you. Now, on the one hand, he believed that, but on the other, he came to him privately by night. He said, some of the fellows, we've been talking this over and we agree. We think there's maybe something to this. Now, Jesus very quickly turned the tables on Nicodemus. You see, Nicodemus didn't come and say, Lord, what must I do to be saved? Nicodemus figured he already was. His name was right up there near the top of the list, He came, in effect, saying, well, maybe, I bet maybe this will make you feel good. I'd sort of like to size you up in person, sort of talk a few things over and sort of get a first-hand feel. But, I'll make you feel good by going ahead and telling you that some of us have talked it over, and we think there may be something to this. There's still some opposition, but you're sort of moving toward having our approval. We may give you the good housekeeping seal of approval here if you, keep it up and just sort of do it just right. Well, Jesus wasn't interested in their good housekeeping seal of approval. Jesus said, I'm telling you, unless you're born again, you won't even see the kingdom of God. Well, boy, that was a shock to Nicodemus. He didn't realize that his being in or out of the kingdom was really something that needed to be discussed until this point. Now, Nicodemus came to Jesus. He was intrigued by his message. He believed that Jesus was from God. A little later, there's a stir going on because of some things that Jesus had said and done here on the Feast of Tabernacles during last year of his ministry, Feast of Tabernacles of 30 A.D. And the story is told here in John chapter 7. And notice when some of the chief priests and Pharisees had sent an officer there into the temple to arrest Jesus. Bring this fellow out. Bring him over to us. Some of the officers, verse 45, came the officers to the chief priests and the Pharisees. And the chief priests and the Pharisees looked at him and said, where's the guy? I thought we sent you to get him. Well, why haven't you brought him? And they said, we never heard anybody speak like this man. They had gone marching over there, stood in the crowd, and just sort of been overwhelmed by what they saw and what they heard, and so they came back and they said, I don't know, we just never heard anybody, we never met anybody like that before. Well, boy, the Pharisees, you talk about getting ready to hit the roof. They said, are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed on him? We know what's going on. We don't believe on him. This people, they don't even know the law. They're cursed. These sorry people, they're the only ones that believe on him. Nicodemus, who's there in the crowd, he pipes up. The Nicodemus says to them, and John adds in the parenthetical statement, he that came to Jesus by night, being one of them. Oh. See, Nicodemus is in the crowd. These are his buddies. He's been with Jesus for this is 2.5 years since the incident where he met Jesus privately by night. Nicodemus hasn't said anything to anybody. Because remember, he's standing right here in the crowd, and what do they say? Why, have any of the rulers believed on him? They didn't know Nicodemus did. See, Nicodemus had kept a very low profile. When Jesus' name came up, he just sort of stayed quiet. They didn't know. Well, Nicodemus, he doesn't come out and make a real ringing declaration at this point. He just sort of adds in, well, now, fellas, does our law judge any man before we hear him and knows what he does? Shouldn't we, give a little more time, sort of check into the facts? And they answered him and said, are you also of Galilee? Search and look. Out of Galilee arises no prophet. And every man went to his own house. Well, they sort of shut Nicodemus down. He didn't want to say any more. Why? Well, these were his buddies. These were his friends. These were the people on the council together, on the Sanhedrin together. He valued their opinion, their approval, the esteem, the respect that he had. Think about it. Now, 2.5 years have gone by. Nicodemus undoubtedly has taken advantage of all the opportunities that he had when Jesus was in the area to be in the crowd to listen. Well, a lot of the other religious leaders had too, so that didn't make Nicodemus stand out. But Nicodemus was convinced 2.5 years ago that Jesus must have been from God. And he knew some of his other friends believed the same way. Or at least were considering that. But they were intimidated by the Pharisees and the chief priests, the ones who were sort of the ones running the show. And so Nicodemus didn't let on. In fact, things must have gotten more and more uncomfortable for Nicodemus, because you don't read of Nicodemus again until John chapter 19. And in John 19, you read about Jesus having been taken out and crucified. And he died. In John 19:38, after this came Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews. All right, up until this time, Joseph didn't take his stand in any sort of public context until the events, or at least what we're told about Joseph of Arimathea in Luke chapter 23. Luke 23 gives us an extra detail. We're going to go back to John, but let me just read you in Luke 23:50, telling Luke's account of Joseph coming and asking Pilate to release the body to him. Behold, there was a man named Joseph, a counselor. In other words, a member of the council. He was a good man and a just. The same had not consented to the counsel and deed of them. He was of Arimathea, city of the Jews. He went to Pilate. Joseph of Arimathea had been a secret disciple. Nicodemus had been a secret disciple. I don't know, had Nicodemus and Joseph ever talked it over before this final council meeting? Things came to a head. Sometimes when you're in a situation and you're you're keeping quiet, there's the official party line and there's a very intimidating atmosphere and you don't speak up. But sometimes you sort of notice from the look on somebody else's face that maybe they didn't seem to like it either. And maybe, they talked a little bit quietly between themselves. What do you think of this guy? Whether they knew it for sure or not, evidently that evening, that night when the trial was held, there were evidently two who dissented and refused to go along with the others. Now Joseph comes out in public and goes to Pilate and asks that the body be released to him. We're told he'd been a disciple, but he was secretly for fear of the Jews. He asked Pilate to take the body, and Pilate inquired and made sure that Jesus was actually dead. And verse 39, there came also Nicodemus, which at the first came to Jesus by night, and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pound weight, and they took the body of Jesus and wound it up in these linen burial cloths. They put off taking a stand. They allowed themselves over a period of about 3 years, intimidated by others and the opinions of others, they allowed themselves to just sort of put off taking any sort of public stand. And the pressure grew, and they kept quiet. Finally, it came down. They really had to step out in faith, because I'll tell you, it's one thing to acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah when He's alive and performing great miracles, and there are a lot of people around who are in the crowd who clearly approve of it, even though the religious leaders did. But now He's a dead man. What's He going to do for you now? At this point, they were confronted with what they knew, and they made the right decision. They put it off. They dragged their feet, they put it off, kept hoping that they would not have to take a public stand in a way that would cost them their position. I don't know how much longer either one of them stayed on the Sanhedrin, but I suspect their days were very quickly numbered. They were not very popular among the men that had been their friends. You see, they were intimidated. Like so many people, they were defined by what other folks thought about them. The approval, the acceptance, the esteem, the respect, even maybe power, position, all sorts of things. You get the idea that these were certainly sincere men. I don't think they were out just for money or power, but they were intimidated by what everybody else thought. Jesus talked to His disciples the night prior to His crucifixion, the night of His final Passover. And you have much of what He said recorded in John 14 and John 15, and notice how John 16 opens. These things, Jesus said, have I spoken unto you, that you should not be offended. They will put you out of the synagogues. Yes, the time comes that whoever kills you will think that he does God a service. Those things will they do unto you because they've not known the Father nor me. Now, Jesus told the disciples, He said, time's coming when they're going to put you out of the synagogue. You think that's bad? Oh, they won't speak to me. He said it's going to get a whole lot worse because they're not going to be satisfied with just putting you out of the synagogue. The time's going to come when whoever kills you is going to think he's doing God a service. I'll tell you what's a whole lot worse than being ostracized. Well, I'm not going to speak to you again. Oh, that's terrible. Well, then the guy comes and he's ready to speak to you again. He's got a club or a sword or a spear and he says, I'm going to kill you. Oh, well, why don't we just go back to you not talking to me anymore? Why don't we just settle for that? Christ said it's going to get worse. They are convinced they're right. And I'm not, wanted to worry you about that. But understand, you are going to pay a price for acknowledging me as the Messiah. You go on here and just turn back a couple of pages to John 14. What did Jesus tell them? John 14:1. As he started into this discourse that evening. He said, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Don't be filled with worry and anxiety. Don't be worried. If you believe in God, believe in me. You don't have to be intimidated by the around. So often people are. That's what they're after. That's what's important to them. It's what they can see. They're intimidated because of the attitude of others. They crave position. They crave various things, power, position. Notice back in Numbers chapter 16, you ever notice how sometimes when people go around accusing others, that in reality what they're doing so much accusing about, sometimes the very things that they're themselves guilty of. You read in Numbers chapter 16 about a man by the name of Korah. Korah, along with two of his buddies, two of his friends, Dathan and Abiram. Korah was a Levite, Dathan and Abiram were sons of Reuben. Verse 2, they rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, men of renown. And they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and they said, you take too much upon you, seeing that all of the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Wherefore then lift you up yourselves above the congregation of the Lord. Oh, they said, Moses, you're in it. You're just on a power trip. You just want to be important. You just want to be right front and center. You're lifting yourself up above everybody else, and you're trying to put all the rest of us down. Now, that's not a good evaluation of Moses and Moses' motives. In fact, we have God's evaluation contained back in Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3. We're told, now the man Moses was very meek, above all men that are on the face of the earth. I don't know of any scripture in the Bible that indicates Korah was number 2. He was the second meekest man in all the earth. Just, humble as he could be. No. How long do you think Korah had been stirring this thing up? Sort of buddying up to some of these, he got a lot of folks stirred up. 250 princes of the congregation, men of renown. Saying, I don't think Moses is doing things very well. I'll tell you what, if I had anything to say about it, you'd be in a whole lot better, you'd be in a whole lot higher position than you are. Yeah. You really, I don't think Moses really appreciates what a capable man you are. Boy, I wish we had somebody in charge that really, get things organized right. See, he went around sort of stirring things up, stirring the pot. Now he says, why, everybody is holy. You put yourself up above the the congregation. You just want to be in charge. Now, who do you think Korah really thought ought to be in charge? Well, see, do you think he was, well, he thought he did. Now, thankfully back in those days they didn't have the Zogby poll and the Gallup poll and this poll and that poll. Moses, your approval ratings are at an all-time low. We think that you need to step down because your approval ratings have sunk, and the polling data that we have indicates that if we had a recall right now, you'd be terminated, and Mr. Korah here, he would be the new man. It's interesting. You see, what did Moses do? Now they accused. They said, Moses, you just want to lift yourself up. You know what Moses did? Verse 4, when he heard it, he fell on his face. Moses wasn't trying to lift himself up. In fact, Moses fell on his face before God. Moses trusted God to fight his battle for him. Moses did not allow himself to simply react to them and try to take it in his own hands. And God fought it very effectively. In fact, God fought it a lot more effectively than Moses could have, because Moses couldn't, have just created an earthquake, couldn't just swallow folks up. God tended to Korah and Dathan and Abiram and all of their crowd. And I'm convinced that one of the main reasons God did it in as dramatic a fashion is that when Moses heard what they had to say, his response was to fall on his face, to go to God, to come to Him and to look to Him and to trust Him. People get caught up in what others are going to think. Korah wanted status. He wanted position. He was the one who wanted all the things he accused Moses of. If you look at the accusation against Moses, you talk about a dumb accusation. Remember, all the rest of this crowd had been slaves in Egypt. Moses was a prince. He was the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. All Moses had to do to be in charge was just keep on being a prince of Egypt. Moses didn't have to go and try to, lead this ragtag bunch. He was a great general. Stephen, in his sermon that's recorded there in Acts chapter 7, refers to Moses as a man mighty in words and deeds among the Egyptians. Jewish historian Josephus, who was a priest that lived in the first century, records a number of dramatic things that Moses was involved in there in Egypt during the first 40 years of his life. If status was what Moses wanted, he had a guaranteed approach to status. But you see, Korah was accusing Moses of the very things that Korah himself was guilty of. Well, you go on, we come on back to 1 Samuel. And in 1 Samuel chapter 15, you have the story, of course, where Saul had been sent out to destroy the Amalekites. And Samuel showed up, and needless to say, Saul had not exactly followed instructions. Samuel confronted him with it, and the first thing Saul did was began to deny it. No, he had really followed instructions. He wanted to argue about it. And then when Samuel really nailed him about what he had done, Saul then admitted it. Verse 24, 1 Samuel 15, Saul said unto Samuel, I've sinned. I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. You know, what Saul allowed to define him was a quest for approval and popularity. Saul wanted folks to like him. He wanted to be popular. Saul was given instructions, but to carry those instructions out, people began to murmur and complain. Saul didn't want to be the target of people's ire. He wanted them to like him. He wanted to be popular. And so Saul gave in and he allowed them to do what they wanted because Saul was courting popularity. Now Samuel confronts him with it. You know, that's what Saul was after, and it of course is a tragic story. Now, you come on back to 1 Samuel 18. David, by this time, has come on the scene, a young fella in his late teens. David has gone out and killed Goliath. And in the aftermath of that, we'll notice here in 1 Samuel 18:5, David went out wherever Saul sent him, and he behaved himself wisely. Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and in the sight of Saul's servants. David rose to the occasion. Saul was the boss. Saul was the king. Saul said, I want you to go over here and attack this garrison of the Philistines. David got men, and he went over there and he attacked that garrison. Saul said, I want you to go over here. I want you to deal with this city. David went over there and dealt with that one. David simply did what he was supposed to do. He went where Saul sent him, and he behaved himself wisely. He did a good job. He really put his mind to it. He did what he was sent to do. And the result was he was accepted in the sight of all the people. Now, that's what Saul wanted, right? Saul wanted acceptance. He wanted approval. He really craved that. David got it, but you don't find that David was wondering, what can I do to be popular? David did his job, and he did it well. And so he had a reputation that began to grow. People said, that guy, he's really, you can count on him. He goes out there and he gets the job done. David went here, he went there, he just did whatever Saul sent him to do. Big job, little job, good job, bad job, whatever it was. David didn't complain and say, I don't want to go do that. Why don't you send somebody else? David was ready to go wherever Saul wanted him to go, and he did a good job. And his reputation grew. Well, he was sent out by Saul to fight this battle with the Philistines. There's no indication that Saul himself went. He sent David. David was successful. There was a great military parade, big homecoming parade. They didn't have ticker tape, but they had whatever they had back in those days. David and the troops were coming in. Of course, Saul's going to lead the parade because he's the king. And describes this women's chorus. They had music and they had celebration and there was all sorts of things. And this women's chorus that was at one point along the parade route, and they had this song that they were singing, and there was all this music. And there was a particular refrain in the chorus. Verse 7, the women answered one another as they played, and they said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth. And the saying displeased him. He said, they've ascribed to David 10,000s. And to me they've ascribed but thousands. What can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. You see, Saul felt threatened by David. Saul defined himself by the status he had in the people's eyes. He wanted their approval. He wanted to be popular. He wanted to be the hero. He wanted to be the center of attention. He sent David to do all this stuff, and David just went and did it. Tried to do a good job. David wasn't courting popularity. David was just trying to do his job and to do a good job. But, as David was successful, then his reputation grew. And Saul became very jealous. And, it's interesting because it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Saul became so obsessed with David, and that's the only word you can really use, that he finally got to the point that he could really not even function as king. He'd hear somebody had sent word, David's over there in those caves of En-Gedi. Well, Saul, take off. Well, he couldn't find him there. Well, hey, I heard he's over here in the Judean wilderness. Oh, well, let's go over here. Saul spends several years chasing all around the country. Every time he gets a report of David, he takes off. Because you see, Saul is convinced that David is his problem. He's convinced that if he could get rid of David, all his problems would be solved. Now, I hope that none of you have gotten to the point where you're ready to throw a javelin at somebody. Saul began to define himself not only by what people thought, but by David. David, I need to get rid of David. If I can just get rid of David, everything will be okay. Everything will be fine. I won't have any problems. I just got to get rid of David. And Saul became obsessed with that, and he was chasing David all over the country. You know the story. He desired popularity. He desired approval. Now, how does God want us to react? Obviously, He doesn't want us to be Korah or King Saul. He doesn't want us to be the Pharisees or the chief priests. Notice what Jesus told His disciples in Matthew 16. Matthew 16, verse 24. Jesus said unto His disciples, He said, If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. Whoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. What is a man profited if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? The Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then shall he reward every man according to his work. See, it's a matter of what are you after. Jesus said, you got to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Sort of interesting. One of the fellows over in Dallas was mentioning to me about, he'd mentioned at an earlier time about a young fellow that he works with and how they would discuss things from time to time. The guy seemed interested, and so he had brought him, a copy of Tomorrow's World and passed on a booklet or two, and he said, he was telling me today, he says, I was talking to this young fellow the other day there at work, and he had, borrowed a couple of things and read one of the booklets, and I said, you're interested in following up on that? You want to talk with a minister or come to church or anything? The guy said, well, not yet. He said, I don't think I'm through sinning yet. He had a few things evidently he had plans on doing, and he didn't really want to. He said, I'm not quite ready yet. I'm not through sinning yet. There are folks that way. They have a sort of short-sighted approach. What's a man profited if he gains the whole world? Sometimes what people value is the wrong thing. One of the familiar stories of Scripture is the story of the prodigal son. Now, he wanted approval. He wanted acceptance. He became a very popular fellow, Scripture tells us. Had just world friends. That was when he was buying all the drinks, It's easy to have buddies. You walk into the bar and say, the drinks are on me. Oh, hey, boy, you're a good guy. Hey, let's set up another round. Boy, you're really an even better guy. That young fellow, there was one person's opinion that he really wasn't that interested in. And that was his dad. So he wasn't really courting his dad's approval, his dad's acceptance. He must have known that when he quit working there on the farm and, took the cash and went to town, that his dad wasn't going to be real happy about that. He wasn't worried about what his older brother thought, and he wasn't worried about what his dad thought. Man, if I can just, all things are so dull around here. Well, all Dad thinks about he wants to get up early and go check on the cows and go check on the sheep, and he wants me down there fixing the fence, and boy, it's just so dull and dreary around here. I want to go to town. Oh, there's a lot of excitement. He got to town, had money in his pockets, and he had a lot of friends. He had them right up until he spent all the money. And then it was like, hey, look, I'm a little short of cash, and I've been sort of spreading a little money around, and boy, I'm running short. Can you help me? Can you loan me a little bit? I just remembered, I got to go somewhere. Boy, his friends found out in a hurry. Some of those guys he didn't have any more money. He didn't have anything that he could do for them. They weren't interested in him. And he went through a period of time of realizing how shallow and empty was the popularity he had bought. See, he valued the wrong thing. What's a man profited if he gains the whole world? He just gains it temporarily. He was the most popular guy in town for a while because he had a lot of money and he was spending it freely. But he ran out of money. And he ran out of friends. He finally got so desperate he was willing to turn around and go back home to ask for a job. And he found out that the only person that really cared about him was the person whose opinion he didn't think counted. Because his dad was the only one there to greet him with open arms when he came home broke. When he came home and didn't really have anything that he had really made a mess out of things. It was his dad that was standing there to grab him and greet him with open arms. You know, it's important to realize, and Christ brings this out here, what we seek, if it is to save our life, if what we're pursuing is to advance the self, if we allow ourselves to be defined by the status symbols, by the things of the around, then we're in serious trouble. If you seek to save your life, you'll lose it. Let's go back to Isaiah 51. Sort of put some things in perspective. Isaiah chapter 51, verse 1. Hearken to me, you that follow after righteousness, you that seek the Lord, look unto the rock whence you're hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence you're dug. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah that bore you. For I called him alone, and blessed him, and increased him. It says, if you really want to follow after righteousness, then look at the example of Abraham and Sarah. They trusted me. They believed me. And that faith, that confidence they had in me, was the real basis of their relationship with me. Well, it goes on and talks about various things of what God's going to do. And notice here in verse 6, Isaiah says, lift up your eyes to the heavens and look up on the earth beneath. Look up, look down, look around, and stop and consider something. You see, all the things you see, the sun, the moon, the stars, the ground, the mountains, everything. The heavens are going to vanish away like smoke, and the earth is going to wax old like a garment. They that dwell therein shall die in like manner. But my salvation shall be forever. My righteousness will not be abolished. Hearken unto me, you that know righteousness. The people in whose heart is my law, fear not the reproach of men, neither be afraid of their revilings. The moth will eat them up like a garment, and the worm's going to eat them like wool. My righteousness will be forever, and my salvation from generation to generation. He says, you look around, you're so impressed with people, with things. Don't be afraid of the reproach of men. Don't be afraid of their revilings. Oh, look at them. They've got all this status. He says, you know what? The worm's going to eat them up like wool. You know, they're going to live, they're going to die, they're going to be planted in the ground. You think the worm's going to come along and really be intimidated and impressed? Oh, you know, this guy has status. Oh, the worm will just chomp in and take another bite. They consume away. They decay. God says, contrast that with what I have. My salvation is from generation to generation. Awake, awake, put on strength. O arm of the Lord, awake as in ancient days. Talks about the redeemed of the Lord returning in verse 11. Notice here, verse 12 and 13. I, even I, am he that comforts you. Who are you that you should be afraid of a man that shall die, and of the Son of Man which shall be made as grass, and forgets the Lord your Maker that stretched out the heavens and laid the foundation of the earth, and has feared continually every day because of the fury of the oppressor, as if he were ready to destroy. And where is the fury of the oppressor? You know, the point is that God is the one that we ought to be impressed with. The prophet exhorts the people. He said, look around. Why are you so intimidated by people? Are you so concerned about your status in the eyes of people? They're here and they're gone. They die. They're going to be around a few days, a few weeks, a few months, a few years. Then they're going to be gone. Be consumed just like an old garment that gets eaten up by moths or worms. You are afraid of them. You're intimidated by them. You're impressed by them. You're so concerned about what they think, and you forget the eternal, the one that stretched out the heavens, the one that laid the foundations of the earth, the one that is forever. Now that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Here were religious leaders in the days of Jesus who believed that he was a teacher sent from God, but they were afraid to stand up and be counted because they were intimidated by somebody that said, anyone that says Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah, we're going to cast him out of the synagogue. He's going to lose his seat on the Sanhedrin. Oh, boy, that's scary. Really? People allowed themselves to be defined by other people, by what people thought. Now, let's look a little further. Let's go back to 1 Peter chapter 2. You know what Isaiah advocates, what Christ talked about in Matthew 16? He that seeks to save his life will lose it. He's willing to lose it for my sake. We'll save it. Christ said, don't pursue self-protective strategy. Don't be focused on trying to protect the self, trying to insulate the self, take care of the self, but trying to ensure that the self is okay. If what you pursue is trying to protect the self, well, you're just going to be reacting to circumstances and situations around you. You're going to allow other people to define who you are and what you are. Notice what Peter wrote here in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. He said, dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conduct honest among the Gentiles. Where they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they will behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourself to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether the king or governors or whomever. He went on to say, verse 17, show honor to everybody, show respect and honor to all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Servants, be subject to your own masters with all fear, with deep respect, not only to the good and gentle, not only to the ones who are good bosses, good masters, but also to the ones that are contrary, the ones that are froward. For this is thankworthy if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully. What glory is it if, when you're buffeted for your faults, you take it patiently? But if when you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently, that is acceptable with God. For even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. Who did no sin, this is the example Christ left, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, was not deceitful and clever and trying to maneuver and manipulate, who, when he was reviled not again. When he was reviled, he didn't all of a sudden, start giving the guy a good cussing and saying, well, you sorry so-and-so, let me tell you. When he was reviled, he didn't do that. He didn't revile again. When he suffered, he didn't threaten. Well, I'm going to get you. I'm going to get even with you. I'm going to fix you. When he was reviled, he didn't revile again. People said things about him. He didn't go around saying things about them. When he suffered, he didn't threaten. He committed himself to him that judges righteously, who his own self bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, being dead to sin, should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you're healed. Your sheep going astray, but now you're returned unto the shepherd and bishop of your souls. Now, stop and think about it a second. We've just read this here in 1 Peter. Let's turn back to John chapter 18. I want to show you something. I want you to stop and consider. Peter is writing about Christ's example. And Peter knew what Christ's example was. He was an eyewitness. But remember something that John brought out about Peter. John chapter 18. We'll read verse 10. This is when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus the night prior to the crucifixion. John 18:10, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and he smote the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, pick up your sword. The cup that my Father has given me, shall I not drink it? You know, one of the other gospel accounts, he tells Peter, don't you realize that even now I could ask of my Father and he'd send 12 legions of angels? You know, the one who wrote about Jesus' example, he said Jesus suffered for us, he set us an example. When he was reviled, he didn't revile again. When he suffered, he didn't threaten. That was written by the guy that pulled out a sword and was ready to chop people up. See, Peter's normal reaction, there's no place that I know of in the New Testament that says, after Moses died, Peter was the next meekest man in all the earth. Peter, it didn't come naturally to Peter when he was reviled to not revile back. It didn't just come easily to Peter when he suffered, not to threaten. When he suffered or when he saw his friend suffering, he was ready to do more than threaten. He wasn't just going to stand there and shoot his mouth off. He was going to pull out his sword and go after those guys. When he cut his ear off, I don't think he was just sort of aiming to just sort of nick his ear. It says he attacked the high priest's servant. The servant, he swung the sword and the servant dodged, and next thing you know, blood was streaming down the side of his head and his ear was laying on the ground. And the next thing they knew, Jesus reached down and picked up the ear and put it back on. And the blood stopped and the pain stopped, and can you imagine the impact that must have had on that high priest's servant? A guy attacks him with a sword. He's coming to arrest somebody. Want to haul him off and take him to be beaten and take him to be crucified. He knows the details of what's happening over the next hours as he sees it unfold. And as he stands there in the guard and he sees all this stuff, it has to keep going through his mind. He saved my life. This guy was coming after me with a sword. He chopped my ear off. You think Peter was ready to put his sword back up then? Well, I guess I've shown you. He put his sword up because Jesus told him to put his sword up. And Jesus picked up the ear, put it back on, and was healed. Well, you don't think that guy kept reaching up there and sort of touching the ear and, thinking, how did that happen? Peter learned a lesson, and at the time Peter wrote 1 Peter, we're talking 20, 30 years after the events described in John 18. How many times over those years do you think Peter relived some of those events in his mind? And he thought about how he tried to handle things, and how totally at variance his natural response was with what Jesus' response was. And so when Peter wrote later in 1 Peter chapter 2, and he said, Jesus set us an example. He said, it's not just enough to sort of grit your teeth and bear it when you got it coming. He says, what about when you don't have it coming? He said, when he was reviled, he didn't revile again. Peter says, I know, I was there. I saw those things. I know how he handled it. Never heard him do that. When he suffered, he didn't threaten. Don't you think that impacted Peter's life? It gave him something to meditate on and think about. It was one of those events during the course of those few days around the resurrection that totally changed Peter's life. You read in the book of Acts on various occasions of Peter being arrested. But you never read of him pulling out his sword and going to it with the guys, and they finally overpowered him and took his sword. Peter didn't handle it that way anymore. You don't ever find any reference to that in the book of Acts. Peter was faced that evening with the absolute total contrast between the way Jesus handled things and the way he handled things. Christ refused to be defined by the attitudes and reaction of others. Just because they were going to yell and curse and scream at him didn't mean that he was going to do that to them. Just because they were going to threaten, just because they were going to do this, just because they were going to do that, Christ did not allow their behavior to make him into something else. He didn't allow them to define what he was going to be and how he was going to act. And that's the key. You see, I opened the sermon by saying, what is it that defines you? Is it other people? Whether it's a quest for status and approval or power or money or things that impress? Or it can be in other ways. You see, we can react to other people and what they do and what they say. And the next thing you know, we've become a different person because of who's around, because of what they're saying, what they're doing. It's changing us. That was a lesson Peter learned that night. Because you see, Peter was ready to get violent and to go to it. And he was faced with a total contrast. Jesus handled it a totally different way. That evening, the following day, and the next couple of days afterward, on up until Jesus raised from the dead, the events that transpired. And Peter's whole life turned around. Totally different perspective. And years later, as he looked back and he thought about some of these things that had happened. And so, of course, what we're told, what Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Have the mind of Christ. We're crucified with Christ, Paul tells us in Galatians. In the life we now live in the flesh, we live by the power of the Son of God who loved us and gave himself for us. Notice in Romans chapter 8. You see, the question comes down ultimately in our lives, are we going to be defined by the flesh or by the Spirit? That's really the issue. That's the issue for all of us. Paul says in Romans 8:4, the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. They that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh. They that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. It's what you're after. Pursuing the flesh or pursuing the Spirit. Now the trouble is, to be carnally minded, to be fleshly minded is death, to be spiritually minded is life. In fact, we're told in verse 8, those that are in the flesh can't please God. But you're not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if the Spirit of God dwells in you. Any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he's none of his. And if Christ is in you, the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. He went on to explain, you see, verse 13, if you live after the flesh, you're going to die, but if through the Spirit you mortify, put to death the deeds of the body, you'll live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. They're the sons of God. Notice, back in the book of Galatians, you know, Peter wasn't the only one of the disciples that had lessons to learn. All of them did. We have a few of those examples. You know, everybody that Christ picked, he didn't just go out and pick the people who were just naturally the most mild-mannered and easy of people. What about James and John? You know, they were good friends of Peter's. They grew up together. They worked together. Well, you remember them. You know, Jesus even gave them a nickname. He called them the Sons of Thunder. And we're not told all the incidents that they were involved in, that nickname, but it was something that fit them. And on through the period of time Jesus was with them. You remember the time when they were walking on the way from Galilee, coming south, coming through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem? Stopped in a little town to buy food, buy something to eat. Folks here said, we don't sell to your kind. We don't want you here. But we're not going to sell anything to you. Oh, James and John, that just infuriated him. He said, Lord, you want us to just go ahead and call fire down from heaven? We'll be like Elijah, just call fire down from heaven, just whoosh, just blow them up. And Jesus said, why don't we just go on to the next town? I've got another suggestion. Let's just go to the next town and sell us something there. See, their reaction and Jesus' reaction were very different. Very different. Well, when they were reviled, believe me, they were ready to turn it back. They were ready to do some serious reviling. When they suffered, and their suffering was going to consist that they were maybe going to be hungry for an extra hour or two. Oh, that's terrible suffering. They were ready to threaten. In fact, what they'd like to threaten was sort of a little nuclear holocaust, right there just centered right here, downtown. Jesus didn't handle it that way. These men, they went through these years they spent with Jesus. And they saw Him handle things very different than they did. They allowed other people to define them, to determine what kind of person they were going to be. They allowed the behavior of others to really be the defining event for them. And what they saw in their experience with Jesus is He didn't allow that. He was not going to be defined by other people. He was going to be defined by God and His relationship to Him. He wasn't going to be defined by the flesh. He was going to be defined by the Spirit. And you and I have access to that Spirit. Let's close here in Galatians 5. Jesus said, or inspired Paul to write here in Galatians 5 verse 16, this I say, walk in the Spirit, and you won't fulfill the lust of the flesh. Walk in the Spirit, and you won't fulfill the lust of the flesh. Talks about being led by the Spirit, and now, down in verse 22, he says, the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and long-suffering and gentleness and goodness and faith, meekness and temperance. Against such there is no law. They that are Christ have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. If you live in the Spirit, let's walk in the Spirit. That's the key. Being defined not by the flesh, but by the Spirit. Not by the around, not by other people, but by God, by our love and trust for Him, by the fruits of the Spirit born in our lives. Coming to have the mind of Christ. Being changed, being transformed. Peter, James, John, all of them. They went through a transformation. They went through a transformation in the way they handled life. And the test that, they had to face, whose approval, whose acceptance was really important to them. You and I, as we look around, we see a world that is defined by the around. We see people, the natural tendency is to be defined by others. And we are faced with the fact that if we will live in the Spirit, then we have to walk in the Spirit. The flesh leads us one way, but the Spirit leads an entirely different way. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus.